to set it up. So when we're looking at, again, we're talking about serious and persistent mental illnesses, and we're going through the different phases, the IGBATTMHO process. We're looking at I, which is just identifying stage of illness and protective factor, right? When we look at illnesses, illnesses go through different stages. So for example, when we look at psychosis, there's a pre-morbid phase where you're talking about no symptoms, may have some risk factors but no symptoms. Then we're looking at the prodromal phase. This is where the person, your family member, you are becoming unwell. You deteriorate from previous level of functioning, characterized by withdrawal, development of strange ideas, some blunted or inappropriate affect. And remember, we talked about before is that when we talk about mental illnesses, we're talking about changes in thought, feelings, and behaviors. So when we start seeing some changes, which is why I said before that when we talk about relapse, relapse doesn't happen overnight. Many times it may be subtle and you don't notice, but when we talk about, especially in the sense of psychosis or bipolar, you see the relapse that's happening. It happens slowly. There changes slowly. So we're looking at the pre-morbid phase, prodromal phase, is when the person or you are starting to become unwell. Then there's the active phase. This is the psychotic phase, usually triggered by stressors. This is when the symptoms are more pronounced. So these are it's the active phase. And then after the active phase, you have the residual phase, where there's a return to the prodromal phase. However, negative symptoms often remain. Positive symptoms subside. Person may still be able to live a full life. And then there's relapse. This is the stages of illness when we look at talking about psychosis. And as I said before, or as I shared before, when we talked about psychosis, psychosis itself means, when you say a person is psychotic, that means they're out of touch with reality. That's all that means. This person is psychotic. They're out of touch with reality. There are different reasons why a person can be psychotic. It could be schizophrenic, it could be bipolar, it could be drugs. Or some other illness. So there are various reasons why a person is quote-unquote psychotic. But when we look at talking about schizophrenia, one of the symptoms of schizophrenia is psychosis, which is what we have here. So again, when we're looking at psychosis, a person being out of touch with reality as it relates to schizophrenia, we can look at this chart here and we can see the different phases. We can see the pre-morbid, the prodromal phase, the active, residual, and then relapse. So again, it goes in the cycle. No symptoms to start and seeing some symptoms. Well, I should say no symptoms to start and seeing symptoms, active symptoms, and then the person, you get better, then you go back down. The goal is we want to catch these symptoms. We want to catch the problem before it becomes active, right? So in other illnesses, mental illnesses, also goes through different stages, right? The first stage, we're looking at warning signs of initial symptoms. So we start seeing warning signs. Often the first stage of mental illness is the hardest to detect. This is because the initial symptoms of a mental illness can be very minor. Also, the symptoms can be very minimal, as more symptoms will only begin to appear as the mental illness progresses to other stages. So again, that's why it's so important that after you have a crisis, a mental health crisis, that as a family unit, we're sitting down and having conversations about what did you see, what did you notice, okay? What did you experience? So everybody's coming together. So you can begin to notice, put together a plan in place to prevent another crisis from happening. Another psychiatric crisis from happening. We don't want to have to call the police again to deal with a crisis, a psychiatric emergency. We're trying to limit the amount of times you have to go, you or your loved one have to go into an inpatient site, have an inpatient psychiatric stay. We're trying to limit that. We want to kind of manage the illness because, again, this is an illness that can be managed. So again, stages of an illness, when we talk about just in general, the first stage is where the initial symptoms, sometimes it's very minor, you can't, you don't really see it at first. It's usually as more symptoms as the symptoms start to progress is when you start paying attention. So we're looking at, that's the first stage. The second stage is where the symptoms begin to worsen. Symptoms become more pronounced and more visible. It is at this point that an individual may become more likely to attempt to cope with their mental illness via self-medicating practices. This includes using alcohol and or other drugs as coping mechanisms. Many times younger people, because we know when we talk about serious and persistent mental illnesses, that these are illnesses that tend to manifest or be seen as a person is a young adult. But what happens is when a person begins to know something is not right, they try to self-medicate. So they may start using drugs, they may start using alcohol, they may start using sex as a way, I don't know really what's going on, I just know that whenever I smoke, whenever I drink, it makes me feel better. Okay, even right now, with so many people are dealing with trauma, with so many traumatic issues that's going on. So we have a lot of young people, or even adults, or people in general. When you start feeling a little down or feeling a certain way, instead of recognizing that this is related to the trauma, this is related to the things that I have to deal with, I may start smoking, I may start using drugs, and which in itself may not be a problem, but because of the reason why I'm using it, i.e. to self-medicate my symptoms, now I wind up having a bigger problem. But again, I don't want to digress. We talk about the stages of illness. The second stage is worsening symptoms. Symptoms become more pronounced and more visible. Okay? And then it's the third stage. Symptoms continually disrupt daily life. Symptoms start to become so severe that they begin impeding daily life, can also affect the loved one. A lack of intervention can become damaging in the long term. So again, then we have the fourth stage. This is where the symptoms are severe. It is the most severe. This is the life-threatening, self-harm. You see aggressive behavior. You see lashing out. This is where we're talking about if you compare it to psychosis. So let me go back there. Let me talk about here when we talk about psychosis. You see the premorbid phase, prodromal phase, active, residual, and relapse. We want to catch the problem right here, right? For those of you who are looking at or watching me, you can see this is where we want to catch it. We want to catch symptoms here before it gets here, right? Let's just say we're unable to do that. We've in the active phase. We're dealing with the active phase now that we're here. Once we're here, this is where we want to have the conversation. This is where we want to begin to put the plan in place so we don't get back to here. Okay? This is with psychosis. When we're talking about just in general, non-psychosis, every illness goes through different phases. So you have the warning signs, which we can say the initial, the second stage, the symptoms start to worsen. They start to cause problems because they're getting more severe now. They're ramping up. And to the point where they become ongoing, persistent. So again, there are always areas where we can intercede, where we can intervene, if we're aware of them. That's why, as a family unit, having that conversation. And I say this over and over and over and over again, how mental illness, severe and persistent mental illness, are illnesses that can be managed just like any other illness. Because I say that because when we look at a lot of the crises that we have that we hear about in the news, somebody with a mental illness, untreated mental illness, becomes, has a problem, they get killed by the police, or they harm the police, or something happens. When you look at that situation, you can see areas or situations or points where if someone were to intervene, we wouldn't have gotten to that point. So the goal is not to get to the crisis point. And if we do get to a crisis point, then we're able to manage that crisis and to bring it and to de-escalate the situation. If we understand that severe and persistent mental illness can be managed, then it'll be better, I think, for all of us, right? So again, symptoms don't just happen overnight. They're there. We're just not aware of them, okay? So again, I also want to point out here, all symptoms, person with serious and persistent mental illness, you're going to have baseline symptoms, right? These are going to be ongoing symptoms, right? So some people may say, even with medication use, say for example, if I deal with auditory hallucinations and I'm taking my medications, I may say that, even with medication use, I still hear the voices, but they're not as severe. I still hear the voices, but I recognize that they are voices, right? I hear the voices, but they're like mumbling, okay? These are my baseline symptoms. These are symptoms that may be there even though you're taking your medication. Okay, I'm trying to see what happened here. Okay, trying to see what happened here. I'm trying to work this new technology here. So again, those are what baseline symptoms are. These are the symptoms that are always going to be there. So again, when you understand what your baseline symptoms are, it kind of helps you to kind of pay attention. It helps you to be aware of what it kind of helps you to be aware of kind of what's going on. So when we have those, I'm sorry, those baseline symptoms, and I'm going back here because it looks like something happened. So when we have the baseline symptoms, as I said before, those are the relapse symptoms, are things that if we pay attention to, we can catch before it becomes out of control or becomes a crisis. But before we do that, we have to know, what are my baseline symptoms? What are the baseline symptoms that my loved one may experience? Okay, hearing voices is not a big deal because I hear voices all the time. That's not a problem. Okay, hearing voices, not being able to sleep well. There are some things that are just part of the illness, right? It's just like if you have diabetes. If you're a diabetic, part of your illness may be, you may just have to take medications, or you may just know there are certain foods that you can't eat. So when we look at baseline symptoms, then we have what's called early warning signs. These are the signs. They do not have to lead to relapse if caught in time. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I shared the symptoms. Consider these stages as warning signs. That's all they are. So when you know what your baseline symptoms are, your prodromal phase, but before you get there, your prodromal phase, when you know what your symptoms are, it's easy for you to pay attention to know what's going on, because now you've identified what your baseline symptoms are. Whether it's always hearing, voices at a minimal, or maybe, sometimes I don't sleep well, but it's manageable. I'm talking with my doctor. I understand where these things are coming from. You know what your baseline symptoms are. Everybody in the family unit knows what the baseline symptoms are. So when you start noticing, for example, that the voices that used to be murmuring are now becoming louder. Now when you notice that it's getting harder for you to deal with the depression, the depression has kind of been there, but you recognize it as a symptom of your illness. You know that sometimes you may not feel like getting out of bed, but you're getting better at it. It's part of the illness. But you notice now you're doing it more and more. These are early warning signs. These are signs that kind of let you know that, okay, let me take a look at what's going on. And that's what you want to do. You want to take a look at what's going on. Okay, why am my voices are becoming louder? Or why all of a sudden? Why all of a sudden am I starting having these kind of thoughts? I haven't had these thoughts in a while. I've never had thoughts of harming myself. It's been years. So why am I having these thoughts now? See, if we can catch these at this moment, that's what we want to do. We want to catch these now. We want to begin to identify these so we can be able to say, okay, what's going on? Are there any stressors going on in my life? Am I anxious about anything? Is there a medication change? Do I need to talk to someone? This is where you want to have the conversation. Because once the symptoms begin to, I keep going up or go down, but once the symptoms start getting worse, once the symptoms are in that acute phase, it's harder. It's harder to kind of deal with it because now I'm so unwell. The auditory hallucinations that were mumblings now have become louder. And where before I used to be able to know that these were it was part of the illness, now I'm in the active phase where I don't know that anymore, right? Because now things have kind of, out of control. We want to catch things before they become out of control. Okay? So again, so you want to determine your baseline, how you are feeling, behaving on a good day, normal day, and a bad day. What's a good day for you? What's a normal day for you? What symptom, right? So you can be able to tell other family members, you will be able to tell that, hey, something is off. Early warning signs are typically deviations from your baseline, often starting with small changes like minor sleep interruptions and then getting worse. Okay? That's why it's so important that we identify what those are. And it's also protective factors. Protective factors can reduce the symptoms and decrease relapse. Medication, social support, family, coping skills, faith, places of worship, religion, spirituality. These are things that can minimize risk factors and strengthen the protective factors and avoid symptoms. Symptoms and the impact can be better managed. Okay? So again, I'm going to stop there. So when we talk about identify stage of illness and protective factors, you want to identify the stage of the illness so you know what's the best strategy what to deal with at that particular time. A person in a premorbid or prodromal phase, the strategies that you use may be different than what you would use if a person is in an active phase. So you want to know what the stages are. You want to know what your stages are. If your family member, you want to know what your prodromal phase are. What does active symptoms look like to you? What are the residual phase? So once you know what they are, you won't panic. You'll know where you are. You can start to see when things are starting to get worse. Non-psychotic illnesses. What are the warning signs? What are your initial symptoms? What does it look like when your symptoms start to worsen? Okay? Do you go from, sleeping, not having any problems with sleep, to maybe not sleeping maybe 1 or 2 hours, not sleeping well, to the point now you're only sleeping 3 or 4 hours now, 3 or 4 hours, to the point now you're not sleeping at all. So again, we look at this one here. You're going from warning signs for initial symptoms, probably having some little problems with sleep. Worsening symptoms, you're only sleeping 2 hours, or only sleeping 5 hours, let's say there, okay? Now you notice you're only sleeping maybe 3 hours. So you get to the point where it's so severe that you're not sleeping at all. You want to kind of catch it, because again, the goal is to catch the problem before it becomes a real problem. So it's important that you know what your baseline symptoms are. You understand your early warning signs. You begin to know what your baseline is and know what's a good day for you, what's a bad day for you or your loved one when things are starting to deteriorate. And you want to be able to identify what your protective factors are. Because if you, for example, let's just say one of the protective factors could be could be your medications. If you start seeing early warning signs, things starting to change, it may mean having a conversation with your doctor to talk about medications. It may mean talking to your family member to talk about some of your stressors. So see, the protective factors are things that can be used to help you to manage the illness. Whether it's a place of worship. Many people draw strength from a place of worship, from being connected to other people, from their faith. Other people could be social support. It could be doing activities. It could be running. It could be talking to people. But what are those things that minimize your risk? That minimize the risk factors and strengthen your coping strategies so that you can manage these. So again, I just wanted to share these. This is something we're kind of doing here, is kind of sharing some slides. So hopefully everybody saw the slides. If not, I'm going to try to find another strategy. But again, this is getting better all the time into health outreach, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith.